Turning right now to one of the biggest narratives of this year, Donald Trump wants voters to beware because according to him, the whole system is rigged.
It's a rigged system, folks. Rigged system.
Totally rigged.
Absolutely rigged.
It's a crooked system. The issue of voter fraud.
Voter fraud.
We're millions of votes ahead. These dishonest people up here don't tell you. We're going to go back to the old way. It's called you vote and you win.
Voting is rigged. The whole deal is crooked, 100%, almost as crooked Hillary.
He keeps saying it, suggesting the election could be stolen from him, and that has dire consequences after Tuesday. I mean, let's face it, this is destabilizing for democracy. So how can reporters cut through the clutter and help voters understand what's really happening here? We have the perfect person to ask, Ari Berman. He's here to help us figure it out. He's a writer for The Nation and the author of the excellent book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. All right, let's listen to Donald Trump from last night in Nevada talking about this issue. He was talking about suspicious behavior in Clark County. Let's listen.
It's being reported that certain key Democratic polling locations in Clark County were kept open for hours and hours beyond closing time to bus and bring Democratic voters in. Folks, it's a rigged system. It's a rigged system, and we're going to beat it. We're going to beat it.
All right, what is he talking about? What's the truth there?
So what he's saying was that there was very high Latino turnout in Las Vegas over the weekend. Lots of people were in line when polls closed, so the polls were extended. This is something that is totally normal and legal, that if people are in line when the polls close, they're allowed to vote. But Trump is making it seem like there's some sort of fraud taking place. And this is a narrative throughout this campaign, as you know, Brian, that anytime things go a way that Trump doesn't like, anytime he's down in the polls, anytime black and brown people are voting in large numbers, he starts to talk about the system being rigged.
Now, that's a pretty incendiary thing for you to say. You're saying when black and brown people, when minorities are voting, he does not like it. He has said he's making a play for African-American voters.
Okay, but if you just look at what he said, Brian, he's talked about monitoring the polls in certain areas of the country, certain communities. He specifically singled out places like Philadelphia that have large minority populations. I think everyone knows what he's talking about. The polling places he was talking about in Las Vegas were almost entirely dominated by Latino voters. And if you look at how he's polling among Latinos, among African Americans, among other people of color, he's polling extremely poorly. So I think all of this voter fraud talk by the Trump campaign, to me, has been one giant dog whistle to try to keep certain people from the polls.
So how should journalists cover it carefully? Let's look at Fox News from yesterday morning. This disturbed me. It was a banner on the bottom of the screen talking about voter fraud. The banner says, running rampant. The clear implication here is that voter fraud's happening all over the place all the time. Is it?
No, it's not. And it's really, as you mentioned, extremely irresponsible for Fox News to be saying this. We have lots of studies, we have lots of data that shows that voter fraud is a very, very small problem in American elections. And that voter impersonation, which is a type of fraud that a voter ID law would stop, for example, is extremely rare. That you're more likely to be struck by lightning, for example, than to impersonate another voter at the polls. So voter fraud is a very small problem. Does it occur sometimes? Yes. But when it occurs, it is usually caught and it does not swing elections. We saw, for example, the first voter fraud conviction in Iowa, which, by the way, was done by a Trump supporter, but leave that aside. The point was, when someone voted twice in Iowa, they were caught. The system worked like it was supposed to. It got rid of bad behavior, and now that voter is facing felony charges, a $10,000 fine, and 5 years in jail.
All right, voter fraud on the one side, vanishingly rare. What about voter intimidation and voter suppression? What do you believe news outlets should be doing between now and Tuesday to educate the public about that?
So this, to me, is a much bigger problem, that this is the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. 14 states, including some very important battlegrounds like Wisconsin and Ohio, have new voting restrictions in place for the first time. And I think the media needs to do a much better job of covering this. When they talk about the polls in places like Wisconsin or Ohio, they need to talk about the fact that what is the law? What kind of IDs do you need? How many polling places will there be? How do you register to vote? And what is the impact? What groups are being impacted? Are younger voters, voters of color being more impacted by these restrictions, for example? What's the justification for them?
Well,
what do the numbers show?
We hear this from progressive publications like yours, The Nation. How do you convince conservatives or conservative media outlets that this is a serious problem?
Well, I think you just look at the data. I'll give you one piece of data. In 2014, North Carolina eliminated reforms like same-day voter registration and out-of-precinct voting. There were 2,300 documented cases done by a very well-known group there called Democracy North Carolina of people who were turned away from the polls in that one election. In comparison, there were only 2 cases of voter impersonation in court that North Carolina presented to justify its voter ID law. So you have 2,300 documented cases of people turned away from the polls and only 2 cases of voter impersonation. I think that kind of data, telling stories of people who have been turned away from the polls, to me is extremely important. We need to see a lot more of that on cable news and broadcast news in particular.
The other factor, of course, the possible hacking of elections. People have been spreading fear that your vote could be hacked. What's the reality on that?
I think it's a pretty unlikely scenario. Obviously, it's concerning given everything we've seen in this election from WikiLeaks on down. The Department of Homeland Security is taking this very seriously. Interestingly enough, they said that the U.S. electoral system is so disorganized that it would be difficult to hack because things are so localized. We don't have centralized databases.
Decentralized.
So it's a concern, but I don't think it's a likely one to happen.
In TV terms, we're approaching the end of the ultimate reality show. Just think about it. Donald Trump has been producing and programming The Trump Show since day one of his historic campaign. And I mean literally producing it.
Look at all the cameras, like the Academy Awards. This is like the Academy Awards. Let's go. Ready? Turn off the lights. Stupid mic keeps popping. I'd love to have those cameras turn over here and just show those people. Don't turn them on. Don't turn the lights on. Gave me a defective mic. Look at that guy. Turn the camera. Turn it. Favor, take the cameras off me and pan the crowd, okay? Go ahead, pan the crowd. Pan it.
Now, this has been frustrating to Democrats like President Obama. This week Obama has been telling audiences, hey, this is not The Bachelorette. And he's been critiquing the media's coverage of the race, what he calls the normalization of Trump's offensive views and outright lies.
But now we act like, I guess this is normal. And as if it's some parody. You can't tell the difference between Saturday Night Live and what's actually happening on the news.
Well, on Tuesday night, you will be able to tell the difference. Election night is the series finale, but it's serious business. Right now, conventional wisdom holds that the race has tightened. The Trump camp says it's expanding the map, finding new paths to 270 electoral votes. And that has some Trump critics worried. My next guests produce a podcast that's become a huge hit this year. It doubles as a form of therapy for worried Democrats. It is the Keepin It 1600 podcast, co-hosted by CNN's own Dan Pfeiffer, also a former senior advisor to President Obama, and John Favreau, who is President Obama's former chief speechwriter. Great to see you both this morning. John, let me start with you. Is this race tight, as we keep hearing on cable news, or is it actually rather steady and predictable?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been pretty stable all along. This has been a 4, 5, 6 point race from the very beginning. There's a few bumps here and there, but like public polls go all over the place, and all we try to tell people is just look at the fundamentals of the race, and don't freak out all the time.
The most popular word on your podcast, Dan, is the word bedwetters. Yeah. Your whole podcast is about talking to Democratic bedwetters, you say, who worry too much about the state of the race. Do you think of your podcast as a form of therapy? What do you model it on?
I think it has become that to a lot of people who are looking for, there's a lot of anxiety around this election for good reason, because a Trump victory would be disastrous for the country. What we try to do is break through a lot of the noise. There's a lot of bad polling, a lot of misunderstanding about the state of the race. We try to explain, based on our experiences working for President Obama, how elections work and why you should have confidence in Hillary Clinton. I think it'd be a very different podcast if the fundamentals of this race were different and it was a closer race.
Do you think of your podcast as being a bit like Nate Silver's role in 2012, providing data to Democrats Democrats saying, hey, President Obama still is very likely to win?
Like, neither of us were math majors, so we don't compare ourselves directly to Nate Silver. We couldn't do that kind of math. But we have, I think, become for a lot of people a place to go to try to understand what's happening in the race. And data is on the side of Democrats here, so when we provide data, it makes Democrats feel better.
I think media with a point of view, what you're doing is increasingly, obviously, playing a role. I wonder, do you think there's a version of what you're doing on the right?
Well, there are a lot of really smart Republicans who, like Mike Murphy, who have started a podcast that are very good. There is much more of a right-wing media infrastructure that people can turn to if they're looking for confirmation bias. We don't pretend to be journalists. We're not telling people what the news is. We're helping explain the news with an obviously biased partisan perspective, but with real-world experience in how campaigns work. Explaining the news, John, let me go back to you because you've had many gripes about cable news this year, about media coverage in general. What would you say is if you could change something, if you could be a cable news executive right now, what would you have changed about the coverage this year?
Well, look, you were just playing the clip of President Obama complaining that this is treated like a game, right? I mean, I was complaining to a very prominent pundit about how his coverage of Donald Trump was much more about Trump's personality, political skills, the game of it all, as opposed to substance and policies and his character. And he said, well, you know, that's the job. Hitler was a good politician too. And I'm like, that is crazy. That is not very comforting to. What's that?
You can go ahead and tell us which person you're talking about.
I'm not going to do that. But no, look, that's
do you think the journalists bring a certain bias to coverage? What kind of bias is that?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think the mistake is people think it's partisan bias, like some journalists or pundits are in the tank for one side or the other, and I don't think it's that. I think it's a bias towards horse race coverage. It's a bias towards sensationalism. It's a bias towards keeping this dramatic and exciting for people. And look, I understand the need to do that. I understand the impetus to do that. But, you know, we have this election, there's so much at stake right now, and there's a lot of people who are scared about the outcomes. And I think there's a lot of stories that have gone ignored because we focus way too much on the horse race coverage.
I think you're right that we need to acknowledge the fear many people have on both sides. That's what's different about this year. Let's look at those CNN poll of polls, though, real quick. The most recent poll of polls bring in the five most recent national reliable polls, all averaged together by CNN. It shows only a 3-point spread as of this morning, with the latest NBC poll factored in. Clinton 45, Trump 42. John, why is that actually not very dramatic? Why is that not something that should be covered as a minute-by-minute horse race when there's only a 3-point difference between the two of them?
No, I think that should be covered as a tight race, you know, but it's also, I think we should realize how stable that is, right? I think we've had wild swings. I mean, this is what Dan was talking about. We have wild swings in public polls, but I think the campaign has always believed, and I think if you look at a lot of the data, that it's been a relatively stable race. It gets tightened once in a while. Her lead gets bigger once in a while, but overall, you know, yeah, but it should be covered as a tight race.
Here's what I want to know from both of you before I have to let you go. Dan, someone who worked in the Obama White House behind us, now is a cable news talking head. I don't mean that disparagingly. What are you going to be watching for on election night?
Well, I'm going to look very quickly at the states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, because the only way in which Donald Trump can get to 270 is to win one of those states. I don't think he has any more than an infinitesimal chance to win those states, but if one of those comes off the map, then he gets a better path. He still has a narrow path, but he has a path.
And John, how about you? What will you be watching for? And thus, what should viewers and anchors watch for?
Yeah, I'll be looking at Florida because I think that there's been a huge Latino surge in the early vote, and I think if she has banked a couple-point lead in Florida when the night starts, it'll be very hard for Trump to catch up. I think she'll win it narrowly, but I think if she wins Florida, then that closes off all of his paths.
What happens, John, after the election? Will your podcasts continue?
We'd like it to. People still want to listen. I think there's going to be lots more to explain, so we're happy to keep doing it.
All right, what is it, 300,000 downloads every time so far? It's interesting to watch how these political podcasts have taken off in this election year. Dan, John, thank you both for being here this morning.